Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn. Welcome to Haven Horizons Lunch and Learn Spring Series. I'm Madeleine McAleer, CEO of Haven Horizons. We are a national domestic abuse prevention centre, and our Lunch and Learn spotlight sessions identify gaps in the response to domestic, sexual and gender-based abuse, and then we propose actionable solutions. So our Spring 2026 series is focusing on the lack of domestic abuse media reporting guidelines. So today, Sarah Harte, our planning and communication strategist with Haven Horizons, is in conversation with Jane Gilmore. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Madeleine, and hi to Jane, obviously. Jane Gilmore is an author, feminist and ex-journalist from Melbourne, Australia. Her areas of proficiency include gender-based violence, gender myths, media representation, or maybe misrepresentation of women, and reporting on domestic and sexual violence. Jane is an award-winning journalist who's been commissioned by multiple leading newspapers and publications, including the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian, The Daily Telegraph, and ABC, among others. In 2015, Jane started the FixedIt campaign, pushing for change in the way the media reports on men's violence against women. 5 years later, she published a book about everything she had learned about men's violence, women's misrepresentation, or representation, and the media, FixedIt. It was published in 2019. Her other books include Fairy Tale Princesses Will Kill Your Children and It Takes a Village to Teach Your Children About Consent. Jane's next book, Rape is a Theoretical Crime, is published this year. She's undertaking a PhD at Monash University, studying what perpetrators of sexual violence think about masculinity and shame, and exploring whether this knowledge could be used to make prevention more effective. And obviously prevention is a word after our hearts, our own hearts at Haven Horizons. So Jane, what first motivated you to rewrite headlines? What was the jumping off point for this?
Hi, Sarah. The jumping off point was I was a journalist and I was reading news written by my colleagues about men's violence against women and just so disgusted by the headlines that were just excusing or erasing men's violence or more really obvious, blatant victim blaming of women. Like this, as you said, started back in 2015. And in Australia, the headlines were just, they weren't even trying to hide it. It was just outright drunk teenager, flirtatious woman. There was one, I think, a horny man sexually assaulted women, and obviously because he was just horny, so how could he help himself? It was just this ridiculous way of providing excuses for violent men in headlines about their court appearances or being arrested for the violence they'd committed. It was almost like somebody was playing a joke. It was that bad. And there was one particular headline that I'd been writing about it as a journalist and getting nowhere. And there was one particular headline that came up where police claimed that selfie led to a stabbing murder, because taking selfies, of course, is what causes murder, not men's decision to murder someone. And I still remember that case. And the guy he'd stabbed this woman over 15 times. He was arrested near the property, I think, or at the property, charged, convicted. He appealed, put her family through the appeal process, which took 2 years, was convicted again, and is still denying that he was guilty, that he stabbed her 15 times in self-defense. And the headlines about the case throughout all of it had all been assuming that it wasn't really his fault. He wasn't really responsible for stabbing this woman that he claimed to love 15 times. It was just horrific. And the response that I got to that first one and to other ones that I did afterwards really showed me how important the project was, because I didn't plan it. It wasn't like I sat down and went, well, what's the best way to understand this and to explain it to people? It was just a reaction. And it was only afterwards that I realized that it was it was the height of social media before it turned really toxic. It was visual, so it was immediate and people immediately understood it. And it wasn't just pointing out what was wrong. It was also showing how easy it was to do it accurately and correctly. And it also provided people with a way of protesting directly to the publishers, not to the individual journalists who never write their own headlines anyway. So it was
Jane,
a combination of affected. Sorry, yep, go on.
no, I was just thinking for what you said there. When you say, you did the first one, it wasn't particularly planned. You were just you were incited to do it by the environment that you'd been working in. But you said you got a response to the first one or the first couple of ones. Who was that response coming from, and what did that look like?
It was just on social media, and it was a response. The response was huge in Australia. It was to that particular headline and then to subsequent ones, because I think there was a lot of frustration with the way the media was reporting and nowhere to focus it, because people who don't understand how journalism works would often think that journalists were entirely responsible for headlines, for images, for all the text in the articles. And I was writing from the inside, so I knew that wasn't the case. And also that piling onto an individual journalist didn't do any good. It just made one journalist, who often wasn't responsible for what happened, feel terrible, but they usually couldn't do anything. But when you direct the protest to the mastheads, to the publishers, particularly when you're talking about people who might also be subscribers, and this was just, when the advertising revenues were really obviously declining, newspapers were desperate for revenue and really starting to worry about upsetting their subscribers. So all those things had an effect, combined with a number of things that were happening in Australia at the time that was focusing people's minds on domestic violence and who was actually responsible for it.
So kind of commercial pressures on the one hand, in a way, when you mention advertisers, the basics of business, and then on the other hand, the cultural landscape. So let's say you've written nearly 500 headlines. If you were to sum up the common thread between those headlines, like what is the connective tissue, the common thread that made you choose all of those?
It was invisible perpetrators and blamable victims. They would either erase the man who had committed the violence, or they would erase his violence, or they would blame the victim. That was one of those three things, if not more, was happening in every headline that I fixed. And back in 2015, I didn't have time to do all of them. I set up Google alerts, so I just get alerts every day on the news headlines that had come out, and it would have been a full-time job to do all of them. So I would just pick one every day. 10 years later, and this is not entirely, obviously not due to just me, there was a lot of other factors going on in Australian media at the time, but 10 years later, I still get those same Google alerts, and the headlines have changed. They're by no means perfect, but it's certainly not daily, or even weekly now that I would look at something and say that is absolutely disgusting, that can't be allowed to stand.
So that points to, a fairly major success on the part of FixedIt. I mean, there's a cultural shift there. And actually, there was just one headline, if you don't mind, because I just chose it myself. Like, there's tons, but I have a legal background, and I just thought this is sort of sporting. And there's an American football player, I'd never heard of him, but very successful for, I think, the Dallas Cowboys, maybe, Reuben Foster. So the headline was, Reuben Foster to miss off-season program to tend to legal issues. And that's astounding. And how you rewrote that was, Reuben Foster allegedly punched his girlfriend in the head 8 times. I mean, tending to legal issues. Yeah. It's a very extreme example of, absolute sanitization. So things have improved in Australia, you've just said. Is that the case?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And while things have improved, there's still cultural problems. There's still problems within media, as we know, and society. Yeah. So, like you mentioned there, newsrooms, and it wouldn't be right to pile on individual journalists, and it wouldn't be, because, as you said, they're often not responsible. Would your view, as a person who worked for a long time as a journalist, as a working journalist, would you think that there's a particular culture within certain newspapers, within certain newsrooms, like quite a male, almost perhaps misogynistic, unconsciously or not?
Yeah, sometimes it's quite deliberate. So there are certain publications in Australia that are deliberately catering to a male audience who have a strong misogynistic leaning. With others, I think it's a newsroom culture that's very male dominated, very masculine, very defensive. So I would often get a lot of pushback from colleagues and editors on the things that I was doing, saying, well, you don't understand how journalism works. Of course, we should be saying that a neighbour who waved to him once over the bins thought he was a nice guy. That's relevant journalism. I'm like, it's not relevant at all to the fact that he just killed his wife and kids. And that took a long time for newsrooms in Australia to understand. And I would say that the change has happened, but it's wafer thin. So because of the public protest and pushback, a lot of editors and journalists don't write things that way anymore, but it doesn't mean they don't think that way. So as soon as those protests die off, or as soon as they think they can get away with it again, I think it would come back.
So it's kind of like almost an episodic reaction to the fact that they perceive that this isn't going to go down with the public, but overall, systemically, structurally, at its deepest level, those attitudes are persisting, is what you're saying.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And also the idea that domestic violence and sexual violence are just women's issues, that men don't really care about them, don't need to know about them or think about them. That attitude's very definitely embedded across Australian journalism. Just to give you an example, in Australia, we have what's called the press gallery, which is all the journalists who are signed up to report on politics. There's about 300 of them. There's about 300 to 400 journalists who are specifically assigned to report on sport. In the entire country, across every single publication and outlet, there is not one single staff journalist who's dedicated to reporting on gender-based violence. Not one. So that gives you an indication of the priorities.
It's an incredible statistic. So you mentioned there maybe receiving pushback in newsrooms at different times or from male colleagues. And something I've seen written, and it's touched on and FixedIt. Like, what would you say, or what have you said really? Because it seems like you've had these conversations in real life, to the idea that headline writing is constrained, by brevity, legal and commercial concerns. What would you say to that? What would your response be?
Yes, that's absolutely true. That you can't. In Australia, and I think the same is true in Ireland, that sub judice contempt is absolutely an issue. You can't say that somebody is guilty if they haven't been proven in a court of law. You can't defame somebody by calling them a rapist if it hasn't been proven. These things are all true, but as I've demonstrated for 10 years in rewriting headlines, it is entirely possible, in fact, easy and more accurate to write an accurate headline than it is to write a bad one. So that was part of the thing with FixedIt, was showing not only, as I said, not only what was going wrong, but how easy it is to do it right. And I wasn't writing paragraph long headlines. I wasn't writing headlines that would have got me, I've never had any legal issues with FixedIt, not once. So these things are possible. It's ridiculous to say it can't be done, because it can.
If you wouldn't mind, before I go on to ask you another question, there's one headline that made me laugh my head off in FixedIt. It's not strictly on domestic abuse, but you're demonstrating what you just said there, that it's easy to take something and to rewrite it very, very simply. So this is from the Telegraph, and the headline also shows you about the assumptions around men and women and sexuality and women's place. The headline is, "Women more likely to lose interest in sex in long-term relationships." So that was the headline in the Telegraph. And Jane rewrote it too, which I absolutely love. "Men more likely to become sexually undesirable in long-term relationships." It's absolutely brilliant. Anyway, sorry, we'll go back to the questions. So do you think the way the media frames domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic homicide influence public policy? Like more generally in the body politic, how people think, what weight do you ascribe to that?
Absolutely. I think the influence possibly isn't as strong now or direct now as it was when FixedIt first started 10 years ago, because social media has taken over from media as a means of getting news about the world. But often social media is sharing media. So something appears online on a news site online and makes its way to social media. So there is a connection there. And words give form to thought. It's how we phrase things, how we write things. And that headline that you just talked about then, the one about the long-term relationships, I use that one a lot because it's a good way of demonstrating things without, makes people laugh, which can take the tension out when you're spending too much time talking about rape and murder. But the underlying myth that men are somehow not responsible for the choices they make to use violence, that women are somehow always to blame for what men do, that women lie commonly and vindictively about sexual violence, that children and women can't be trusted when they talk about the things that men have done to them. These are all really common myths, and they are absolutely embedded in the way we think and talk about violence. So when they're reinforced in the media, then you'll get people picking up language from the media and using the same phrasing because it's becomes common. So we talk a lot about victim survivors in Australia, for instance. That's the thing that's made its way to the media and is flooded through the media. But a victim survivor is an experience, not a person. And we're talking about a person who is always much more than that one experience or that one relationship.
Yeah, I mean, you touched there on sexual violence as well. So we're talking domestic violence, domestic homicide, and sexual violence. And in FixedIt, there was an interesting study. It's actually an old study, but it's a very important study. And you make that point. It's from the University of Virginia. And it shows how 83% of rapists interviewed for the study did not view themselves as rapists. They had many, many reasons as to why they weren't. There was a massive cultural minimization of sexual violence going on there. And then 65% of those interviewed felt that women had led them on and they'd had no choice. And then you link that to the endorsement by the media of rape myths, which is, as you point out, very dangerous. So really it is very incredibly powerful what we're reading. And I think as consumers, we're all guilty of this, that we read quickly and we're not necessarily kind of unpacking what we're reading. So unconsciously we are being fed these very strong messages. So I was going to ask you about the impact of the FixedIt project, but you've kind of spoken about that. You've said since you wrote the book in, was it 2000, you started the project in 2015, and you said there's been a significant improvement. So did you have contact, you know, when you started this and it was like a stone gathering mass, the project, you know, became a very substantive project, which led to a book. Did you have much contact with media organizations or former colleagues who were still working as journalists, or what was their take on it?
I did. Some of them, I did get a fair bit of pushback and it was put back on me of, oh, well, you don't understand how journalism works if you're saying that we should do it your way. And I was saying, well, I think journalism is supposed to be about accurate reporting, and what you're doing is not accurate. But I would also often hear from journalists who'd written stories that appeared in FixedIt, and they would message me privately, often young women, saying, thank you, I tried to get my editor to not use that headline because it was awful, and they wouldn't listen. That happened quite a bit. Our ABC, which is like the BBC of Australia, Australian Broadcasting Commission, which for a few years there was doing some really just dreadful headlines. They actually came to myself and a woman called Jess Hill, who wrote an award-winning book here called See What You Made Me Do. Yeah. So they came to Jess and I and asked us to do some training with all of their senior editors across the country, which we did, and they did a lot of other work as well. And since then, the headlines and the stories from the ABC have been vastly improved. So it does actually demonstrate that when you get understanding of the issue from senior management and they require training and change from the top down, that works. There was a distinct before and after difference. And I think the other thing that made a huge difference in Australia was there was one particular case of a man who murdered his wife, his daughter, and his 3 grandchildren at Margaret River in Western Australia. And he was described in the headlines as a granddad, as a great bloke, as a loving father. And we have a segment on our ABC called Media Watch, which does weekly reporting on good and bad journalism through the week. And they did a segment on it that was largely based on a lot of the concepts in FixedIt. And after that, we didn't get that, oh, but he was such a good dad after he murdered his kids reporting. That was really, I think, that Margaret River Media Watch was the tipping point for journalists to be able to, I think, go back to their editors and say, no, we have to do it a different way now because the audiences are just not responding.
Okay, that's interesting. So you have 2 things going on there. You've got your tipping point at Margaret River, and then you have, which is very interesting, I think, the ABC training and you have the top down from the management getting the training, but then you have the training on the ground. And I think you probably agree that a hell of a lot of journalists, or I mean, maybe you wouldn't, but that they're well intentioned, but if we don't have the training, if you don't have the knowledge,
Yeah, they just don't know.
they just don't. Yeah,
They're working off the same myths that the general public is, all those rape myths you were talking about. Most journalists, who are often men, particularly the journalists who are reporting on crimes and court reporting, which is where you get a lot of reporting on men's violence, they've been brought up with the same myths that the rest of us have, and they're often unexamined. So they really need a lot of work to understand how those myths influence the way they write.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, like, as I said earlier, as consumers of media, we often read things in an unexamined way, but it's more problematic if there's a particular culture that, it happens in so many organizations. A culture is handed down. The next lot of people come in, they're mired in that culture, they marinate in it, and even if they don't like it, they're forced to, and on we go. So that training is, that's very interesting that you saw a massive impact on the headlines that ABC were producing. If you were to update the book today, what new trends or changes in media reporting, if any, would you include?
I think some of what's happened is good, in that what I see now when I get those Google alerts is a lot more reporting on structural difficulties. So what happens when women go to court? What happens when you try and get a restraining order? How easy are they to just ignore? What happens when women try and leave? So there's a lot more reporting on that. But I think that's only by specific publications, and it's almost always directed at women. So it's become, let's do some reporting on women's issues, rather than, no, this is a men's issue. Men are the ones overwhelmingly committing these crimes, and we're still not doing enough to prevent them. So we need to start targeting this kind of reporting at men in the way that they can read it and understand it, and recognize that all men have some responsibility in preventing these kind of crimes, that it's not something that they can just leave for women to deal with. I think also the connection between news media and social media needs to be recognized more, because we often talk about them as if they're completely different things. People don't follow the news anymore, they get all the news from social media. But social media pulls its news from news media. So there's a constant circulation going through there, and I think we need to stop thinking and talking about them as two separate forms of media, but rather a linked and a feedback loop going on between those two forms of media.
Yeah, and I think also to find a way, which is a topic for a different day, of trying to impose some standards on social media, because that's the Wild West. So, and as you say, then things get circulated. If you could change one thing about how the media reports on DSGBV, what would it be? If you'd one thing, like you'd a magic wand, and I said to you, right, choose your magic wand, Jane.
It would be to have expert reporters embedded in every publication who can do the kind of reporting that's necessary, that's accurate and well informed, and understanding what they're reporting about and the effect of what they're reporting. That expertise we don't have anywhere in Australia. As I said, there's absolutely no one. There's some very, very good freelancers, but I've done a lot of freelance work myself, and you have to go to an editor, you have to convince the editor to publish you and to pay you and to put it out to their audience, and to not edit out the things that they think might upset some of the men in the audience, which is constantly a problem. Or that response that I've had quite a bit, which is, but we've already done domestic violence this year.
Yeah. I'm familiar with that. And so before we go to a Q&A, the last question I'd like to ask you is, and then we'll open it up, we'll hand you back to Madeline. What practical advice would you give us if we were going to, which we'd like to, compile domestic abuse media reporting guidelines? Any bits of top tips?
I would say to work with journalists, not try and write them without journalists and then impose it, because journalists are a very parochial bunch, and they believe, with good reason, that people outside journalism don't understand the restraints. So if you work with journalists to put those guidelines together in a way that journalists can say, yes, this is written by people who understand what I do and the limitations on what I do, that would make a significant difference.
Okay, well, that's great, Jane. I'm going to hand you back now to our CEO, Madeline, who will handle the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And thank you so much, Jane, for that. If you haven't read Jane's book, Fixed It, or you haven't watched her TED Talk from Sydney, or TEDx Talk, I'd really recommend both, and we can drop the link for the TED Talk into the chat. And Jane was saying just before we came on that if people have any problems getting her book, they can contact us and we'll sort that with Jane. In terms of it being available here in Ireland. It is available because we managed to get a copy. So next week, it's the last session in the spring series of the Lunch and Learn, and we will be looking at the key takeaways from the 6 speakers that we've had. We had Susan McKay, Christine Doherty, Luke Hart, Professor Susan Leahy, Sonia McMullen, and of course Jane today. And many of the similar issues, each person had their own, specialized area or personal experience or academic take on it. So we're going to try and pull out those key takeaways and then discuss what next steps we need to take in addressing the gap in there not being media reporting guidelines on domestic abuse in Ireland. So we'd really welcome people to join us and to join us for that discussion. And we did ask each speaker at the end, what advice would you give us? So we'll be including their advice as well in that conversation. And all of those sessions from the spring series, as I say, they are available on our YouTube channel at Haven Horizon. So if anyone wants to catch up on those before next week, they're all there on YouTube. And you can also keep up to date with the other work we're doing on our social media, or have a look at our website, havenhorizons.com. So just a little legal bit now. This project is part of our Shared Island project, where we have Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid as our Northern Ireland partners. So in terms of the disclaimer, so it's kindly supported by the Shared Island Civic Society Fund from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And the ideas, opinions and comments in these events are entirely the responsibility of the presenters. So I will stop recording now and we'll go to questions. Thank you for watching.